Thank you for tuning into this video about Iran's political culture and their society. So let's talk about the citizen society and the state of Iran. There's a lot of great videos out there about minority groups in Iran. There's a lot of great videos out there about women in Iran, and you'll see some of those in my slides here. I'd recommend checking them out. Otherwise, I'll put them in the calendar for you to peruse as well. But let's talk about social cleavages. First of all, religion can play a role as a major social cleavage because Iran is a theocratic republic. But there's actually not a lot of tension. A majority of the population is Shia and Sunni. There is a very small chunk of the population that is Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian. As you may have heard me talk about before, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians are typically referred to as the people of the book. They are monotheistic faiths that have some similar religious texts. At least Jewish, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have some common texts and some common religious figures. So they are seen as pretty well-respected groups. Members, Christians, and Zoroastrians aren't treated any differently from the Shia and Sunni population. They still have to follow Sharia law, so they still are under the law of Islam, but they can continue to practice, which is not necessarily the case in like China, with an atheistic state that has tried to take control or eliminate Christian factions. Now, the Baha'i faith, of course, has been treated differently. It is seen as a cult. It's seen as a kind of a corruption of Islam. So for people that practice Baha'i faith, they want to practice their faith and they want to not be treated differently, but the Iranian government has treated them differently and has kind of persecuted these groups in ways that the other groups are not targeted. So religious minorities are, they're given rights. They are, protected. They're not persecuted in any way. Even though they do have to follow the rules of the republic. The Baha'i faith has struggled with trying to spread the religion. The Baha'i faith has had reports of executions and imprisonment. The Baha'i faith has had issues with people that practice Baha'ism being prevented from going to the university, being prevented from getting travel visas, stuff like that. Now, ethnicity can certainly be a potential social cleavage in Iran as well. The majority of their population is Persian, but that leaves open the possibility of also very large minorities. The Azeri population, specifically in the northwest, is a huge chunk of the population. It's 24%. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of conflict. So you'd probably say that there isn't a lot of conflict. Iranians, worry about the Azeri people. They don't want them to want to create their own state or join up with Azerbaijan. So Iran, doesn't want to scare that group away and wants to make sure that that land stays part of Iran. So you probably see more, once again, trying to include the Azeri people, trying to include the ethnicity into their political culture, into their regime. Even though the Azeris don't speak necessarily the same language, and there is a variety of languages in Iran. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Azeri people can't be included. And they are strongly Shia, so that does help the Iranian government in maintaining control over that region, rather than them breaking away. So, we look at religion and ethnicity. Those are issues that we would think would tear Iran apart. But religion is pretty solidly one religion, and the smaller religions are respected. And ethnicity, there's a huge divide there, but Iran doesn't want to lose chunks of their country where it's predominantly a different ethnicity, so they try to keep them there. Very different strategy from China, who kind of tries to make those minorities even further a minority in their region, and persecutes those ethnicities. Very different from, what we probably expect, as far as having some very, very small minority religions Iran isn't necessarily persecuting them. Whereas some countries like Saudi Arabia certainly get a more negative connotation for their treatment of other religious groups. Let's see. We do certainly have some social class divide. Some of that does have to do with the past regimes. The upper class tended to be a group that supported the Pahlavis, supported the Shah. So that created a divide between the wealthy and the lower middle class and peasantry. Today, the regime gets a lot of support from the poor and the middle class, partially because the regime goes out of its way to help out the poor, goes out of its way to provide social services for the middle class. They're benefiting from the regime. The regime's aiming at that group as their foundation, and they're focusing on infrastructure in communities that are more lower middle class, rather than focusing on making the wealthier wealthy. And they can use a lot of the money from oil to try and help these different groups. So middle and upper middle class, they tend to be more secularized. This is a huge impact from the Shah, that they tend to be more secular. They tend to want to see less clerical involvement. It creates divide between the populace that exists in Iran. And if you see people protesting in Iran, it oftentimes comes from the middle and upper class, from semi-wealthier people that may be more critical of the regime, especially at times where the regime may make decisions that are easy to criticize, like the Iranian government shooting down that plane in January. This group of people tends to be the ones that go out there and protest the regime, whereas the peasantry and lower middle class, they're not. You do have a social divide, kind of ideologically, in Iran. You have conservatives that want to see the regime under control of the clerics, that want to maintain Sharia law. They want to keep things the way they are. And you have reformers that kind of follow the more liberal idea that they want to change things up. They want to secularize things. They want to, institute a more pure democracy, not necessarily the indirect choice of the supreme leader. In fact, they might want, more specific term limits for supreme leader. So you have reformers out there. I wouldn't say that they're extreme, as in they want to see less, cleric control. They want to see more secularization. They want to see more democracy. But there's not a lot of talk about getting rid of Sharia law entirely. Even in the clerics, you do have some divide. I wouldn't focus too much time on it, but just know that the clerics certainly can be a little divided about what they want to focus in on. Where some want social justice, some want to focus on the economy. Now, civil society has gone through a lot of transformation. Under the Pahlavis, it was certainly suppressed, except for the upper class. Under different presidencies, you saw rights and freedoms kind of curtailed, where in the 90s, you saw a lot of freedom of speech and press, freedom of assembly. And then under Ahmadinejad, you saw a lot of the reversal. So he didn't necessarily trust peaceful protests, didn't necessarily trust websites and books. And oftentimes they were critical of him, so he shut down stuff like that, shut down newspapers. And today we're probably seeing a lot more civil society forming. The youth is very active. The youth is very interested in protest. Remember, protest, as far as participation, may be frowned upon by the regime, but historically speaking, the Iranian people have seen protests do big things, where protests were able to take down a regime, where protests were able to, try to stand up to the U.S. government at times. So protest can be seen as a way to get things done, even though it's frowned upon by the government. So we've seen a lot of protests over the years. Here's some examples. Oftentimes the regime cracks down, but that doesn't necessarily mean they stop. they kind of keep coming back because it's such a big part of their culture. And it's not like the information's been completely suppressed. People want to keep pushing for change. So we've seen protests, in particular, there's some key protests like in 2009 where people protested the election of Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad was pretty unpopular for the Iranian people, and the fact that he won re-election angered a lot of Iranians. So we saw some major protests there. In fact, here's the protest from that Green movement protesting Ahmadinejad. But in fact, there were protests of the re-election of the most recent president. So, you know, Iranians might find different reasons to protest different leaders. There have been protests against America and the ending of the Iran nuclear deal. There have been protests of the Iranian government over their decisions with the airplane and the missile strikes. And definitely, I mean, I have a video about women protesting the veil, and that might be something important to check out. Our last thing we're going to talk about is women in Iran, because they are treated differently than a lot of our other AP6. Women are, in particular, a group that has not been treated the same as men. Now, under Ahmadinejad, not under Ahmadinejad, under the Pahlavi family, under the Shah, women were treated with more equality. Remember, the Shah wanted to westernize things, and he wanted to open things up. But that didn't necessarily, stick around when Sharia law was instituted. So, I mean, today, women are certainly allowed to run for office. They can run for the Majli, and there's a very small chunk of the population that is elected there. Women theoretically can apply to run for president, but they've always been barred from actually making it on the ballot. They have that the president must be a well-known person and must be a religious political man, and that tends to keep out the women. There are a lot of women that are doctors, that are government employees. There are a lot of women in the universities. I think it's like 55 to 60% of the university population is women. There is difficulty getting jobs. Men have, basically seen women as not belonging in doctoral positions and government employee positions. So women have faced kind of discrimination and stereotyping, despite the fact that there are so many women that are becoming doctors and becoming bureaucrats and becoming, different, well-educated positions in Iranian society. Now, Iran would call their women equality with difference. So there are different laws, but they would say that men and women are equal. Now, for example, they would say that, okay, men and women both have to follow Sharia law, but Sharia law itself treats men and women a little differently, like divorce laws that favor men over women, or dress code policies that would basically restrict women to wearing scarves. So you can see the scarves, the veil, whichever choice you want to call it. You can call it either. So women are required to wear these. Now, under Ahmadinejad, remember there were kind of vigilantes, and there were basically like dress code police out there forcing women to make sure they're covering their hair, make sure they're wearing long coats. This has been relaxed, and it's become strict at different times in Iranian's government, and women can face fines, and there have been violence against women who refuse to wear the veil. And even if you're like a tourist, or if you're a news reporter coming into Iran, you'd be required to follow these customs. So fines tend to be, the major crime for bad hijab or not wearing the hijab properly, whereas the repeat offenders tend to get punishments that are higher, to be made example of. Like lashes, which would be whipping, and time in prison. Now, women cannot necessarily, there's some other ways that women are different. Women cannot leave the country without permission of their relatives. That certainly puts a lot of restrictions on women as far as leaving the Iranian regime. And of course, we've talked about how women and men are treated differently when it comes to stoning to death and, crimes of adultery. Women might be seen as, might be sentenced more often to death, essentially. They have seen some changes as far as women at sporting events. So that's what you're seeing on the right. Women were initially not allowed to attend male sporting events, like soccer games and stuff like that. Now women are, allowed to attend and be involved in sporting events. And I think that's some sort of international sporting event that you're seeing in the image here. And just talking about women's rights and women's issues is not allowed. So pushing for change in this realm is very difficult. This is nothing like Saudi Arabia, though. A lot of students get this in Saudi Arabia confused. I actually was on an FRQ a few years ago that involved Iran and women's rights, and there were a lot of people that put down the fact that women can't drive, and that's totally a Saudi Arabia thing. Women can drive in Iran, and some people thought that women had to wear a burqa. That is not true. In Saudi Arabia, there may be rules like that, but in Iran, it's only the hijab, only the headscarf that is required. So make sure you get the right facts for the right country if you're asked about women in the AP6. Okay, well, I hope this video helps, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.